Good evening.
Good evening.
I love it. You know, it's always a great way to try to start with a little bit of community and getting your voices in the room as well as the voices you're going to be hearing from up here. So thank you for coming out tonight. Welcome. My name is Peter Hammer. I direct the Damon J. Keith Center for Civil Rights and teach here on the law school faculty. And it's my honor to welcome you to this evening's event, but even more important to me is to be able to introduce somebody who is very special to the law school and to the center. So Husna Khan will be coming up. She's the outgoing president, which means she's graduating, which is the exciting news, and will be sitting for the bar and is now going to be adding one more JD to the fight for social justice. She found the Muslim Law Students Association not in the state that she wanted it when she arrived, and being an advocate for social justice as an undergraduate and through her career has really reinvigorated the student organization. And I'll tell you the secret of a great law school: you get good students, right? And the students make the school. It's not the other way around. And it's really been a pleasure to be able to learn from you, to look at you, to see all of the activities that you have shepherded, some of which I never thought would have been possible, but you have shown us what is possible. So I'm welcoming Husna Khan to do the introductions. Good round of applause.
So I have the privilege today of introducing Professor Blanche Cook, but before I do that, I just wanted to thank you to Professor Hammer, Professor Cook, Professor Beydoun. These are three giants in their respective fields, beyond the legal fields. If you just look up their names in LexisNexis, which you know, we love getting those Lexis points for Starbucks gift cards for the whole students in the room, you will be amazed at how many law review articles they've written themselves, how many articles they've helped co-author. So if you're interested in entering the field of law, please do yourself a favor and look their names up. Google also is your best friend because they have very impressive credentials to their names. As the outgoing president of the Muslim Law Students Association, I am incredibly honored to have gone to Wayne State Law, and I look forward to staying in touch with both the esteemed professors in front of me as well as Professor Hammer, because change does not occur overnight, and we can all do things in our daily lives to halt social injustice, and I think that time is now, instead of waiting for somebody else to come along. So yeah, go out and be creators of change. So Professor Blanche Cook joined Wayne Law School in the fall of 2014. She teaches criminal law, criminal procedure, and race in the law, which I'm a student of, and it's an excellent class. She earned her Bachelor of Arts degree at Vassar College and her law degree at the University of Michigan Law School. Most recently, she served as an Assistant United States Attorney with the United States Department of Justice, where she specialized in large-scale drug and sex trafficking prosecutions. Prior to joining the United States, I'm sorry, I'm a third year and the sleep deprivation just hit me hard, everybody. Let me try that again. Prior to joining the United States Attorney's Office for the Middle District of Tennessee, she clerked for the Honorable Damon J. Keith, judge for the United States Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, who is also a long-time advocate for justice. Professor Cook has established herself as a leading expert on sex trafficking by problematizing the entire spectrum of sex trafficking prosecutions and the commercialization and the exploitation of flesh. She is actively involved in shaping the emerging nationwide discourse on sex trafficking and victims' rights as it relates to evidentiary issues, race, class, gender profiling, and sex trafficking statutes. Her current research trajectory focuses on the ways supremacy creates places of vulnerability for purposes of exploitation, domination, and control. And at this point, I would like to give it up to Professor Blanche Cook to introduce Professor Beydoun. But before I do that, please give them a big round of applause for this wonderful event tonight.
I have the distinct privilege and honor of introducing Professor Beydoun. Professor Beydoun is an associate professor of law at the University of Detroit Mercy. He previously served on the University of California, Los Angeles School of Law faculty, and he currently serves as an affiliated faculty member with the University of California, Berkeley. specifically in its Islamophobia research and documentation project. He's had extensive experience as an attorney working within the realm of civil rights, criminal defense, and international law practice. A native of Detroit, Professor Beydoun earned his law degree from the UCLA School of Law and his bachelor from the University of Michigan. He also holds a master's degree from the University of Toronto. He is a regular commentator on pressing issues. He contributes regularly to Al Jazeera English, serves as an expert consultant for the U.S. Census Bureau, and has featured his opinion pieces in the New York Times, Washington Post, Newsweek, Salon, and the BBC. Having said all of that, our business today is to discuss Professor Beydoun's most recent work, and that is American Islamophobia. We'll have copies available after our talk for purchase and also signing, and I strongly encourage you to purchase this work. This work is beautifully written. It is vivid in its detail and breadth. It clearly demonstrates Professor Beydoun's rich knowledge of the subject matter, that subject matter being Islamophobia. It is comprehensive. He engages a detailed analysis of Islamophobia in all of its hegemonic permutations throughout history and across the globe. He details the rise of Islamophobia throughout history. He details the way in which Islam gets conflated with terrorism globally. You make a concrete case for Islamophobia operationalized as government policy. You argue that this conflation of Islam with terrorism is characterized in political discourse as a clash of civilizations, a kind of us versus them, civilization versus the barbarians, good versus evil. You talk about how Islamophobia becomes dialectical in nature, and that is shared between individuals and structurally. And all of that gets reinforced via the news, media, Hollywood, philosophy, legal doctrine, and religious doctrine. You are clearly bold, courageous, and unflinching, as evidenced by your calling the U.S. government out on its government policies targeted at Muslims, including the travel ban and countering violence extremism, or CVE. You are equally bold, courageous, and unflinching in the way in which you call out the U.S. government as co-opting Muslim religious and civic institutions by providing CVE funding in exchange for surveillance of Muslims. You have denounced anti-black animus and homophobia within Islam itself. You have proudly asserted yourself as part of the critical race theory tradition, and you have placed your work, particularly this book, within its canon, calling out the law as the site of white supremacy construction, the law as the place where white supremacy gets created and constructed. In keeping with the CRT tradition, you use your positionality as moral authority. You weave in and out of the first person singular in this work as a reflection of your willingness to proclaim and announce your story. Your work is at once scholarly and activist. It is an analytical critique and a work of activism. You have also put your finger on the pain that almost 2 billion persons suffer at the hands of Islamophobia. As one of my students described to me this pain as so palpable that Islamophobia interferes with her ability to worship. It is a pain so palpable that it interferes with your relationship with the divine order. So, having said all of that, I want to say something to you, to all of my students, to everyone in the audience, as well as your father. You are living, breathing evidence of the existence of God, because you have to be anointed to pull off a Herculean feat like this, my friend. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor, my privilege to introduce to you Professor Khaled Beydoun. So Professor Beydoun, I wanted to ask
Can I say really quickly, that's the best introduction anybody's ever given me?
Well deserved, very well deserved. So I wanted to start off by asking a group of questions about the utter centrality of white supremacy and the current rise of white nationalism on both sides of the Atlantic. So these questions involve the centrality of racism and particularly anti-black animus. There's an argument that we have not seen this kind of rise of white nationalism as socially normative on both sides of the Atlantic for decades. I've also noticed in my brief time in the Academy that the Academy likes to reward bad race scholarship. And what do I mean by bad race scholarship? What I mean by bad race scholarship is scholarship that'll take some sort of societal phenomenon that white supremacy directly causes and attribute to that causation to anything but white supremacy, right? And when the Academy does this, it's an example of the way in which white supremacy is constantly rendering itself invisible, obfuscating itself, and disappearing, right? But one of the things I love about your work is that you avoid cleansing Islamophobia of its racial dimensions. There's a clear argument that the law is a site of creating white supremacy, that the law itself uses mechanisms like citizenship to construct white supremacy, that the Muslim ban, for example, is a racial project, that racial project being white supremacy itself. So my question is this. Unfortunately, this is like a question from the audience where there's a whole lot of narrative and then the question, but here's the question. Would Muslims be persecuted if they were phenotypically white? In other words, you're not being profiled in the airports because you're white. So the question is, would Muslims be persecuted if they were phenotypically white? For example, other religious minorities come to this country and are white but not subjected to the same kind of treatment. Sikhs are being lumped together with Muslims, not because they are white. And there's an argument that you are reviled and profiled because you are phenotypically black. So my question is, would Muslims be persecuted if they were phenotypically white?
So the short answer, is my mic on? Can you guys hear me? So the short answer is yes. And there's a question of scale also in terms of what persecution will look like hinging on phenotype. And I want to address phenotype a bit later, but the reason I say yes so vehemently is because historical record demonstrates very vividly that individuals who phenotypically meshed or could pass as white, but were still Muslim, were still perceived and then ruled by civil court judges to be beyond the framing of what whiteness meant during the naturalization era. And again, for those of us who don't know what the naturalization era is, from 1790 to 1952, whiteness stood as an explicit, express mandate for citizenship. You had to persuade a civil court judge that you were in fact white to become a naturalized citizen. Muslim immigrants coming from a range of different regions of the world, many of them who could phenotypically pass as white, coming from the Levant being modern-day Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, Jordan, and so on, would pass that test, right? They had fair skin, they had lighter hair color, they sometimes had green and blue eyes, but because Islam was being constructed as far more than a religious or a racial identity, but in fact a civilization, right? A rival political ideology. These individuals who otherwise could pass as white were denied whiteness, and as a consequence of that, denied naturalized citizenship. So that is the historical foundation that still persists today. That Islam is far more than something we can detect phenotypically or outwardly, but it's also an ideology that lives beneath the racial surface, if you will, that preempts individuals who might pass as white to be deemed non-white, and even more than being deemed non-white, as individuals that cannot be reconciled or assimilated into the American experience. And again, phenotype is it's only one measure of racial identity, right? And the courts during the naturalization era oftentimes looked at phenotype to assess whether the individual could pass as white. It did so strategically and situationally. Civil court judges knew that if phenotype was going to be the measure for admitting, let's say, a South Asian, an Arab, or somebody from East Asia, for instance, into the country, they'd flip and use another test. They use a geography-based test, or they use, a test based on eugenics. So phenotype has never been the primary, sort of criterion for assessing whether an individual qualifies as white or any other group. And we know, as critical race theorists, we reject that idea because we know that racial identity is far more complex in a construction that is, tied to a range of things, including religion.
There's an argument that citizenship, if you are white, is a privilege, but citizenship, if you're a person of color, might be a place of precarity.
Yeah.
So I also wanted to ask you a series of questions with respect to the rise of white nationalism. And again, there's an argument that the kind of white nationalism that we're seeing on the rise on both sides of the Atlantic we haven't seen for decades. And I'm wondering if this rise perfects itself because it creates narratives about internal threats and external threats. So what I have behind me, for those of you who can see, is an image of Willie Horton and one of the Ayatollah Khomeini. For those of you who are not familiar with Willie Horton, this image was used by the first George Bush to make the claim that ruling class elites could protect white working class, poor whites generally, from the evil menace known as Willie Horton, who was released on a furlough. And during that time, he had committed a bunch of crimes while on the furlough, while he was still serving a prison sentence. And then, of course, Ayatollah Khomeini. But what I want to suggest to the audience, and also for you and your comment, is whether this rise of white nationalism is perfected by both this internal threat represented by an internal black menace and an external threat represented by Islam. Is that what is part of what's perfecting the supremacy and also the reach of the supremacy on both sides of the Atlantic?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think, I would venture to say that the white supremacy that's been manifested through the codification of policy, law, and specific programming to grapple with this imagined black menace has been far more damaging than the explicit sort of race and white supremacy we see rising to the fore in the form of policies like the school to prison pipeline, in the form of policy like the expansion of the carceral state, in the form of policy where we have the erosion and entrenchment of affirmative action programming. That is white supremacy, right? I think we need to move beyond this narrow framing of individuals wearing hoods or neo-Nazis or now this new white identitarian movement led by Richard Spencer, who looks like a J. Crew ad or something along those lines, as being the exclusive and only manifestation of white supremacy. It's far broader than that, right? I think it's really critical to understand that white supremacy is, in its most exacting and vicious form, a system of law. So we grapple with it internally through the justification and mainstreaming and expansion of policies that are pillaging, that are absolutely, bludgeoning black communities. But we don't confront these laws with the same sort of rage and alarm that we do the rise of white supremacy that is generally geared towards individuals we sort of frame or caricature as outsiders, right? People like immigrants, people like Muslims, people like that we envision to be, sort of beyond the indigenous or domestic body politic. I think African Americans are framed as a domestic threat, largely speaking, maybe tweaked a bit now with the Trump administration, where we see him saying things like, we don't want immigrants from Africa, shithole countries, or Haiti, and so on. And people like Opal Tometi are doing great work with regard to addressing immigration concerns faced by black immigrants. So I don't want to construct this false binary, right? But I think, historically speaking, white supremacy as a legal system has been deployed against African Americans in a very vicious way through law passed by both conservative and democratic administrations. Now, I think the rise of white supremacy as we know it today, both here stateside and in places like Europe, with Brexit, the Pagoda movement in places like Germany and other parts of Central and Eastern Europe, I think are spearheaded primarily by a fear of Islam and immigrants at large that are brown, right? Whether they're black, or whether they're brown immigrants from places like Mexico and Latin America and Central America and so on, or Muslims, right? Largely from Muslim majority countries. That is, I think, what is spearheading at least popular purchase on the ground with these movements. But we can't disentangle it from an anti-black racism that functions as its anchor.
Absolutely. Let me ask you this too, and along the same lines, is white supremacy in this country entering the mainstream through the narrative of protecting the white middle and working class, or white people generally, from Islam? Is there a way in which Islamophobia is allowing that narrative to enter the mainstream?
Oh yeah, I absolutely think so, and I think you can track that politically, right? So before the rise of Trump, for instance, we know that the Tea Party was in many respects driven by an Islamophobic clash of civilizations fuel and rhetoric, right? So we see the Tea Party, for instance, advancing and spearheading these anti-Sharia legislation bills that were being advanced and percolating throughout the southern states, the Midwest, and even the Southwest, and so on, laying the table, if you will, right? Making the table and facilitating for the rise of Trump 3 or 4 years later. So, and because the fear of Islam is not, and the fear of Muslims is not a contemporary phenomenon. And that's why I wrote this book. I wrote this book because I was really frustrated with this overarching media narrative that Islamophobia is a new phenomenon, that Trump is the individual who is, catalyzing it, and, sort of spawning it. But these tropes are deeply embedded in the American imagination, right? Through Orientalism, through the legal embrace of foundational Orientalist tropes. And Letty Volk, who wrote this article called "The Citizen and the Terrorist," a UC Berkeley law professor, writes how 9/11 leads to the redeployment of Orientalist tropes that are deeply ingrained in our minds. But what Islamophobia does is it tweaks them and gives them a modern sort of face, couples them with modern narratives, and ties them to prevailing contemporary transnational terrorists that are still driven by these foundational tropes that have existed for a long time. And white supremacists, whether white supremacists like those folks marching into Charlottesville or those running for office, capitalize on these tropes, wield them into full-fledged campaign strategies and win offices based on these stereotypes.
Absolutely. And just by way of background for our audience members, can you lay out what Orientalism is and how your work on Islamophobia is distinguishable from that or adds to that?
Yeah.
What it is that you're at?
So my definition of Islamophobia starts with the idea that Islamophobia is a modern emanation of Islamophobia, of Orientalism. Orientalism is the mother of Islamophobia, and Orientalism, for those who don't know, is this theory, it's this worldview, it's this master discourse that is framed by prominent Palestinian American intellectual by the name of Edward Said, where effectively Western thinkers, Western statesmen and women, Western artists, scholars, novelists, tastemakers, influencers began to define themselves as the West in mirror opposite terms of the Orient being synonymous with the Muslim world. So if the West is where modernity flourished, if the West is where democracy and liberalism was pervasive, if the West is where women had equal rights, if the West was always forward-moving and dynamic, then the Muslim world had to be everything but. Had to be savage, backward, static, totalitarian, violent, always sort of riddled and embedded in war. These are stereotypes that we still know today. If you pick up a newspaper, you'll find headlines saying things like, "Why is the Middle East always at war?" These aren't new headlines, these aren't new messages. These are ones that are deeply rooted in these Orientalist narratives that Islamophobia as a modern extension of Orientalism effectively revitalizes.
Okay. I want to turn our attention over to shootings of police officers. And I want to share this with the audience, but in 2014, 2 shooting sprees occurred 6 months apart in busy American cities. One was in New York City, one was in Las Vegas. They both had uncanny similarities. In both events, multiple people were shot and killed, including 2 police officers. Both ended with suicides and both involved ominous anti-government messages left on social media. But one crime received nearly 5 times as much coverage as the other. And what was the key difference? One shooter on my right, on the audience's left, was Ishmael Brinsley. He was Muslim. And the other shooters, a white supremacist couple named Gerard and Amanda Miller, were not. New research finds that print journalists, there may be some in the audience, but print journalists are about 4 times more likely to report on terror attacks when the perpetrator is Muslim. There's also research that a perpetrator who is not Muslim would have to kill on average about 7 more people to receive the same amount of coverage as a perpetrator who's Muslim. So I'm interested in your thoughts about this. Any thoughts about this?
Yeah, so the first immediate thought is that, Muslims tend to be generally newsworthy when they're villains and not victims, right? So there's this media inclination to want to overcover, culprits of violence, whether mass shootings or whether a petty crime, if they're Muslim. The second is, this reminds me a lot, for those of you who've taken constitutional law, I teach constitutional law, the McCleskey case. If you've read McCleskey, there's this really famous study called the Baldus study, effectively looking to demonstrate that the prosecutors in Georgia had a greater inclination to sentence black culprits, black shooters, to the death penalty than white shooters. And we can track these media statistics and map them really nicely with the Baldus study. That when the culprit is either black or brown, or in this instance black and Muslim, that the prospect of looking to indict them, and indictment in this sense would be greater coverage by the media, is far greater. And that maps really nicely with the Baldus study, that when the shooter is black, the death penalty is assigned at I think it was a 6-to-1 clip, than if the culprit was white. And then there's another sort of variable, right? Like, who are the victims? If the victims are white, or generally white, then there's a higher sort of prospect of looking to indict or incriminate, either by way of the death penalty as a sentence, or either by way of greater coverage in the media. So there's always this interplay that, when we have a black or brown culprit, that the prospect of them being overcovered by the media is far greater. And that's really tied to white supremacy again, right? Which delivering, perpetually manufacturing, and hammering home these negative tropes that we attach to black and brown skin. And then the additional project, obviously, of holding individuals who have nothing to do with these acts to be collectively and collaterally guilty. That's why we have, for instance, when there's a nominal Muslim attacker of some kind, there's an expectation that every Muslim have to condemn or sometimes even apologize for their doing. If there's a black man who goes to McDonald's and doesn't pay, then there's a racial profiling project of all black men in that vicinity. That isn't true for white culprits, right? I think the greatest privilege of whiteness is the ability to be an individual. That you are not going to collaterally or collectively indict the group you belong to. And we see this, right? We see this with narratives like the lone wolf narrative. Nobody's responsible for what Dylan Roof did, or what Stephen Paddock did, shooting up that country concert in Las Vegas. But when it's a shooter like Omar Mateen in Orlando, then every Muslim has to reckon with him.
Absolutely. So you're dead on here. So there's a way in which Dylan Roof goes into a church, for those of you who don't know, shoots 9 black people, and he's a lone wolf immediately.
Yeah.
Immediately after this incident occurs, he's characterized as a lone wolf. It is seen as aberrant. However, if someone who's nominally Muslim kills someone, then the whole of Islam gets indicted, right? So, but part of this too, I think, is not just the way in which we profile the perpetrator, but this idea of the lone wolf dynamic is, I think, another way in which we dismiss persons of color as victims. When we say that part of the narrative of this being aberrant, lone wolf, is also a dismissal of the victims involved. But we can get back to that. I also wanted to switch over now to a set of questions involving police officer shootings. And this is where police officers have actually shot and killed civilians. Both you and Edward Said argue that Islamophobia has been characterized as a clash of civilizations. Again, the war between good and evil, us versus them. And my question is that same kind of narrative also a part of this spate of police officer shootings and killings? Eric Gardner, Orlando Castile, Rikia Boyd, Aisha Stanley Jones. In other words, is this narrative about who's entitled to occupy public space? It has Islamophobic permutations, but it also has permutations with respect to the way this narrative gets carried out in the arena of these police officer shootings. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I think the clash of civilizations theory, which is coined by a Harvard scholar by the name of Samuel Huntington, he wrote this really influential essay in 1993 of that title. I think it was in The Nation, and then he made it into a book.
Best-selling.
It was a best-selling book, and not beyond just a best-selling book. It had the year of halls of power. So presidents, he had the year of Clinton, but he especially had the year of the neocon administration under George Bush. So Clash of Civilizations is effectively just a retweaked, renamed, modernized iteration of Orientalism. The thesis effectively is that the West, the United States, is on this collision course to be at war with the Muslim world. You know, and again, it's built upon these problematic baselines that the Muslim world is monolithic, and that it stands as a civilization, one cogent, homogeneous civilization, which is the furthest thing from the truth. But we see the clash of civilizations worldview juxtaposed with the maintenance and expansion of anti-black racism as a project here stateside in really dynamic and destructive ways. And you can see that intersection, I think, through the way citizenship is envisioned. There's a scholar by the name of Linda Bosniak. She's at the Rutgers Law School, I believe, and she wrote a really great book. I highly recommend people read this book. It's about it's called the Citizen and the Alien, and she deconstructs citizenship as far more than just a formal status, right? We're citizens because we hold specific legal sort of relationship to the land and so on. We have formal citizenship, but then we also have substantive citizenship, right? Substantive citizenship is effectively a status where you're a formal citizen, but you don't have all the rights, you don't have all the privileges, you don't have all the benefits that come with formal citizenship. We understand this to be, when we hear the term second and third class citizens, for instance, right? That is a specific iteration of what substantive citizenship means. And we see minimized or diminished substantive citizenship being manifested by people like Eric Garner, Sandra Bland, Trayvon Martin, individuals who are formal citizens. We can't deny that, right? But as a consequence of them being black, as a consequence of them being poor, as a consequence of them trying to occupy specific spaces on street corners to earn a living, to provide for their families, they're second and third and fourth class citizens, and as a consequence of that informal substantive status, are viewed by the police or agents of the state as being disposable. In the same way that Muslims coming from abroad are viewed as disposable, maybe not disposable, but as threatening, and thus individuals we shouldn't let into the country. Which is why we have this idea of disposability being effectively weaponized through policy like the travel bans against Muslims, or in policies like ubiquitous policing, violent policing, racist policing in communities where black people dwell.
Absolutely. So I want to go to a series of questions problematizing this idea of the black-white binary. So I want to set this up by giving the audience a number of quotes. I think you can read this, but in case you can't read this, I'll go through these. So the first of these is a quote by the philosopher poet Richard Pryor. And Richard Pryor stated that immigrants become American by learning how to say the N-word. Then the next quote is from W.E.B. Du Bois, and this is from The Souls of White Folks. And he says that immigrants become American by learning how to say the N-word. And then, of course, Toni Morrison, she states that in the United States, learning to distinguish oneself from and express contempt for blacks is part of the ritual through which immigrant groups assimilate. As Morrison explains, if there were no black people in this country, it would have been balkanized. And that when immigrants got off the boat, the second word they learned was the N-word. So what I want to problematize and explore is there's an argument that American identity gets constructed on a continuum of honorary whiteness and denigrated blackness. I understand that there will be critiques of the binary, but is there an argument that American identity gets constructed on this continuum of honorary whiteness and denigrated blackness, and that to belong or to be a citizen in this country is predicated on how closely you can assimilate whiteness and disassociate yourself from blackness? We've seen, for example, in the recent election, that allegiance to whiteness can supersede class interests as well as gender interests. It's just that powerful, right? Honorary whiteness and denigrated blackness is central to the construction of American identity. How does your stance on whether Muslims should be a separate category in the census respond to that critique, exist in tension with that critique, or how does this all come together?
Yeah, so I definitely echo the quotes on that slide that for non-black Muslims coming here, back in the naturalization era, when whiteness stood as an explicit mandate or prerequisite for whiteness, the way that whiteness was performed to the gatekeepers, legal gatekeepers, was through anti-black racism, right? The move towards whiteness is always performed and propagated through engaging in not only voicing that you're not black, but also buying into the American project, the racial and racist project of anti-blackness. And not to say, especially with regard to the Arab world in the Middle East, I hate using the term the Middle East, but I'll do it for sake of convenience and brevity, that there are distinct forms of anti-black racism that exist in those regions as well. But when the law here was premised upon immigrants having to prove to judges that they were in fact white, they did so by engaging in anti-black racism. Beyond that, though, again, I would strongly stand against the creation of a standalone classification of Muslim being a racial classification, because we have Muslims of all races. We have black Muslims, or the biggest plurality in the country today, historically have always been the biggest group of Muslims. We have Latino Muslims, for instance, who are the fastest growing Muslim demographic in the country. We have white Muslims, we have Arab Muslims, South Asian Muslims, and so on. Islam is the most diverse, racially diverse faith group in the United States. So racializing Muslim identity is problematic because it, effectively glosses over and erases the standalone racial identities of individuals who practice this religion. It's a religion. Islam is a religion in the same way that Christianity is, Judaism, Hindus, and you can belong to any, you can be a member of any race, generally speaking, to practice that faith. So I contest the racialization and reject the racialization of Muslim identity.
Where do you stand on whether Muslims should be a category under the census, or what are your thoughts about that?
So I oppose it, but I was on the Census Bureau, and I actually, I was a consultant for the Census Bureau, and I actually supported the creation of this Middle Eastern or North African box, which is an ethnic/geographic box versus a religious box. But a couple of months ago, I just learned that the Trump administration doesn't want to go forward with it.
Got it. Okay. So now I wanted to switch to a series of questions about being complicit in your own demise, the business of horizontal violence, the business of persons of color internalizing the dominant discourse, and being complicit in their own demise or our own demise when we execute horizontal violence against one another. So there's an argument, of course, that hegemony is at its best when you become complicit in your own demise, right? We understand the coercion, we understand the consent prong is particularly strong when you can get a person of color or a woman, for example, to be complicit in his or her own demise. So having said that, I wanted to read for the audience a passage of your work on page 144 for a couple of different reasons. One, you have said this infinitely better than I ever will. It will also give the audience an opportunity to hear the richness of your writing. So bear with me, folks, if you can imagine a fireside here, and maybe Kvassier or cognac. Okay, so on page 144 you write, turning Muslim Americans against one another is a direct effect, if not an intentional strategy, of CVE policing, also known as counter-violent extremism. This is particularly true in places like the metropolitan Detroit area, where divisions along national, generational, and mostly potently sectarian lines arm DHS and its local interlocutors with the dangerous tools to carry forward CVE programming and policing. By pegging specific Muslim traditions, practices, and cultures, most notably Sunni Muslim populations, as prone to radicalization, the state is drawing clear economic, political, and sectarian divisions within the broader Muslim American population. Driven by clear articulations of the good and bad Muslim, CVE policing creates a landscape in which those who endorse CVE policing and partake in its programming as informants and collaborators are deemed good Muslims and good Americans, while those critical of it and critical of structural Islamophobia at large are not only perceived as bad Muslims, but more dangerously are subjected to possible CVE policing. So in that paragraph alone, it's incredible. You've got a lot going on there in terms of themes and the way you're able to masterfully weave so many narratives together. I'm particularly interested in your thoughts about this paragraph with respect to complicity, hegemony's perfection, when you can get people to co-opt and be complicit in their own demise.
Yeah, so I can't take credit for the theory that sort of drives what Professor Cook just read. Some of you might be familiar with a really prominent post-colonial thinker by the name of Franz Fanon, who wrote a landmark book many years ago called Black Skin, White Masks, right? And in this, I highly recommend this book. It definitely has strong contemporary relevance with the war on terror, but also respectability politics and, sort of concerns that, plague communities of color at large. So what Fanon talks about is this native informant complex. And the native informant is effectively a member of a specific subordinated or stigmatized group that is effectively co-opted and enlisted by the state. There's an exchange. There's a specific barter and exchange. You guys took contract law consideration, right? And the consideration is whereby the individual who sort of trades in on his or her racial or religious identity gains personal benefit by the way of access to the state, by way of maybe a job with the state, by way of having close proximity to power. But the exchange is that they're doing really destructive things to the communities of which they represent. Another professor by the name of Hamid Dabashi, Columbia professor, writes about this in his book Brown Skin, White Masks. It's sort of a modern rearticulation of Fanon's work to the Muslim community. But yeah, I'll give you guys a story. So a quick story. The last month and a half or so, I've been touring, talking about this book, right? And somebody convinced me to debate the head of MPAC. You guys might know MPAC. You might not know. It's the Muslim Public Affairs Council, based out of LA. Their executive director hates me because I've been openly critical of them in the media sphere and so on. But MPAC is a longtime sponsor of counter-radicalization policing, right? They've received DHS grants. They've set up parallel programs. They work really closely with the LAPD. on radicalization projects, but also projects that are geared towards poor Black and brown communities throughout Los Angeles. I lived in Los Angeles for 7 years. I was a student there, and I was an activist on the ground working on a range of issues in LA. So I know the organization, and they're threatening to sue me. Which is good press for the book, actually, because the first print of the book actually sold out, so maybe it was a good thing. No, I guess no press is bad press when it comes to books. But it goes to the idea about how there is not only a cottage industry of individuals who are Muslim that are more than happy to sponsor war on terror policing and programming because it benefits them, right? They get invited to really high-profile events. They might get employment at places like DHS. They're going to get a heavy honorarium from think tanks or subcontractors that work really closely with the administration. And we see this very visibly with characters like Ayad Hirsi Ali, Arshad Manji, Asra Nomani, Zohdi Jassid, these types, right? Individuals are really prominent and have built careers effectively. This new guy, Majid Nawaz, for instance, who is sort of an understudy of Sam Harris, who's leading this new atheist movement. There's an entire industry, an entire class of Muslims who are leveraging their racial and religious identity as some sort of expertise to speak about the horrors, the vileness, the evil of Islam to a largely white audience, right? To perpetuate, to propagate these tropes and negative narratives. So great personal benefit. But these are only the individuals on the far right. Right? During the Obama administration, we saw what I call moderate native informants coming to the fore. Individuals who were working really closely with the State Department to advance counter-radicalization as a foreign policy project. Working really closely with President Obama. And it's key to know that countering violent extremism was established by the Obama administration, right? So surveillance during the Obama administration becomes more intense than it was during the Bush administration. These are individuals, these moderate native informants, who sort of project publicly a progressive discourse and identity, but behind closed doors are actually advancing and being part of really destructive programs and policing projects being deployed, largely speaking, in poor and working class Muslim communities. So there's an important class dimension that is seldom discussed, that is really at the crux of what is happening with the domestic war on terror and how these native informants, who are largely in very elite spaces, disconnected from the communities where programs like counter-radicalization are wreaking havoc. So religion is a big part of it, but we can't deny the importance of where socioeconomics comes into play with regard to who's experiencing the brunt of war on terror policy, but who's actually championing it from a Muslim perspective.
Interesting. Okay. I want to turn pivot a little bit, specifically to Ayad Hirsi Ali, and the business of using feminism as a vehicle for racism and white supremacy. Mm-hmm. You argue that, and hopefully I'm not mischaracterizing your argument here, and certainly if I am, please correct me, but I think there's an argument in your book that Ayad Hirsi Ali, who is a Somali-born Dutch-American activist and so-called feminist, and as one feminist, I assert my feminist privilege of calling her a so-called feminist, but in any case...
I didn't say that.
I said that. But there's an argument, I think, in the book that perhaps she has also been co-opted in the agenda of Islamophobia. She is a vehement critic of misogyny and sexism in Islam. She's a strong denouncer of female genital mutilation. And here's my question. Is it your argument that she is, and there are others, who are hijacking feminism in order to engage in a kind of Islamophobia? That's a tough question.
Yeah, that is a tough question, and I gotta tread lightly because I'm a male, right? So I don't want to say the wrong thing.
Right. Let me see if I can rephrase this question a bit, if it's helpful at all. There's an art.
Can you move your mic? You're coming in and out. You can't hear you because it's on the wrong side. Right. If you put it on this side, then we can hear you the whole time.
Okay, and this is why we want Professor Atawani to stay here with us and never leave.
All night.
All night, for dinner, as well as throughout her career. But is that better? Is that better, folks? Okay, and please don't hesitate to let me know if something's not working at all. And thank you so much, Professor Atamani. I will work on the pronunciation of your last name. But in any case, we want you to stay. In any case, okay. Back to the question. So there's an argument that feminism gets hijacked in the agenda of Islamophobia.
Yep.
That I can bring one of my students actually crystallized this for me. There's a way in which, here's a better way of phrasing this, a little safer, I think, as well. There's a way in which people are more than willing to jump up and down and engage a sexism critique for Islam, but didn't have anything to say about Roy Moore, right? So is there a way in which people are hijacking feminism in the agenda of Islamophobia? Now, having said that, the next question I'm going to ask you in all fairness is there room for a feminist critique of Islam without engaging in Islamophobia?
So let me answer the former question first. So I think that it's critical to understand that feminism, or one specific strand of feminism, because feminism is, a deeply diverse and heterogeneous intellectual tradition and movement, but one specific strand of it has been used as a white supremacist project on the foreign policy front, either as a colonial project historically, or either as a project to justify and carry forward war in Muslim-majority countries, right? We see that very clearly in places like Afghanistan, right? So much of the narrative when they were, kind of beating the drums to launch war, advance war in Afghanistan is, we got to save these women who are compelled or forced to wear the burqa, right? You had a projection of many white women, largely speaking on behalf of these women, and effectively imposing specific feminist ideals that are inimical to Western feminist perspectives and positions. So to answer the latter question is, there is a strong feminist movement within the bounds of Islam and within Muslim communities that is typically sort of relegated when we're talking about feminism. We never hear about these women, these feminist scholars, and some of them are actually professors at American law schools, like Asifa Qureshi-Landis, the University of Wisconsin Law School comes to mind. Their names are never sort of, risen to the fore of media or popular discourses when feminism is discussed. It's always Hayyan Hirsi Ali. It's always Asher Nomani, Irshad Manji, right? Individuals who aren't scholars and who haven't had the training to understand or even analyze different schools of Islamic thought, Madahid, and so on. We see it also with Islamophobia being carried forward in more explicit and state-sponsored ways beyond the United States, beyond the American experience. If you look at the legislative record of debate before the enactment of the headscarf ban in 2004, you see these basic Islamophobic tropes driving the decision to overwhelmingly support the headscarf ban, that these women are compelled to wear the headscarf. Their uncles, brothers, and fathers are forcing them to do it. This idea that Muslim women are subordinate, weak, passive, disempowered, and so on. These tropes are sort of what are fueling a specific sliver of Western white feminism, right, that becomes one of the key ideologies to justify colonialism and war in the region. So I think there is room, to answer the latter question, there is room, and there's a rich tradition of feminists who are Muslims, who are trained as scholars, who know the canon, either with regard to Islamic scripture or secular American law, who are purposefully being relegated and ignored because they're not pushing this convenient narrative of indicting Islam as being sexist, patriarchal, in the same way you have Hayyan Hirsi Ali and these other characters projecting that narrative. They're never going to come on Bill Maher, right? Hayyan Hirsi Ali will, because these scholars who know their stuff, can't push forward this, this basic black and white Manichaean narrative that we're so used to.
Absolutely. So I want to pivot now to Second Amendment issues and arguments, and specifically Second Amendment religious freedom arguments, homophobia. and Islam. So in a number of the marriage rights cases, the gay marriage rights cases, plaintiffs are arguing that they shouldn't be made to serve, for example, a gay marriage and make a cake in violation of their Second Amendment religious freedoms, right? My Second Amendment religious freedoms mean that I should be free of having to make a cake in the service of a gay union. And in these contexts, we're seeing very robust Second Amendment freedoms claimed. And my question is, where is all of this robust Second Amendment religious freedom when it comes to Islam? Where is the claim that, this is my religious freedom, I live in a world and I live under a constitution that exercises a tremendous amount of religious freedom? Where does all of that go when it comes to the practice of Islam?
It's interesting. You see these debates, kind of circling around this case, master, what's it called, master cake shop or something like that?
I think that's it.
Something along those lines, right? So we're justifying that private businesses can engage in discrimination towards generally LGBTQ customers because by virtue of serving them, it's compromising their free exercise of religion rights. So there's situational support for free exercise of religion, specifically when the target or the objective is discrimination. But we're willing to compromise or diminish or, in some respects, categorically, bludgeon the free exercise of religion rights and advancement of the war on terror. So, on one hand, we want to honor and respect the free exercise of religion rights of bigots, but we don't want to honor the free exercise of religion rights for Muslim Americans because as a consequence of Muslims maximizing their free exercise rights, that becomes scary, that becomes suspicious, and that becomes the grounds or basis to deploy surveillance, monitoring, and programs like counter-radicalization. And there's whiteness at play. Whiteness is sort of the elephant in the room with all of this, right? Because we envision, or white supremacy, we envision these business owners and store owners as being white business owners who effectively should have the full-fledged right to use religious views and religious perspectives as a basis to reject serving a specific demographic, which is bad business. You want to expand your market as broadly as possible. A couple blocks from where I live in Dearborn, there's a corned beef sandwich shop, and they have like the sign in front of their business that says, "We proudly serve pork." And they intentionally put that sign up because they know that community is largely 95% Muslim, right? So they're making a sort of like a banal kind of political / Islamophobic point, but it's bad business. You're eating into your profit margin. And that's the economic commentary. The legal commentary is we're willing to protect religious rights when they're white individuals looking to advance bigoted objectives, but we don't want to protect or safeguard the free exercise rights of a largely brown or imagined brown community because we tie them so closely to the prospect of terrorism.
I wanted to leave some time for the audience, but a final set of questions with respect to how to resist. What does resistance look like? What should we do? I'm really quite proud of the slide. I'm not sure if you can see it well in the audience, but I will leave this to the audience to read. But here I want to go to page 151 of your book. And again, I'll read this to the audience. And again, I'm pivoting here to what exactly we should do. How should we rise up? What exactly are we charged to do, given all of the arguments that are made here? And you write on page 151, we need to wake up and say, you know what? Enough is enough, stated Ibak Osman, whose family owns a small cafe in a Somali shopping mall in Minneapolis. Quote, we are citizens, we are taxpayers, we own businesses, we need people to understand that we also are part of this country just the way anybody else is, end of quote. While Muslims are asleep, DHS and local law enforcement are pushing CVE policing, planting informants, and paying collaborators to be a part of this new war on terror, witch hunt, a persecution against which citizenship sadly offers little protection. any thoughts you would care to elaborate that idea of resistance with me?
Yeah, so yeah, I'm often asked, and I've done a lot of these talks now, the last question is, what do we do? What are our possible prescriptions? What are possible solutions? And I don't know, I really don't know, and that's I know it's kind of a trite response, but I sort of have my academic forecast
Sure.
that I'm happy to give, but I'd rather end on a positive note and give an uplifting sort of message versus my academic forecast. But I think you sort of foreshadowed earlier on to say that this country is currently experiencing a moment where, given demographic projections of this country becoming majority-minority in 2045, that there's this real angry, vile, bigoted underbelly of white supremacy that's rising to the fore. And I think that's going to be the case for the next 25 to 40 years, to be frank with you. I think this country is going to experience a real sustained rise of white supremacist populism for some time, and it's going to be projected in who wins offices both federally and locally, and I think that's a front that we're going to have to grapple with in the imminent future. So I want to say this too. I read this book when I was writing my book by J.D. Vance called Hillbilly Elegy, and my really radical and liberal friends get mad at me for praising this book, but I thought it was a wonderful book. I thought it was really well written. I disagreed with his conclusions, but I really agreed with his analysis and my ability to sort of humanize who and what the white working class was and why they're so ripe for being exploited by demagogues like Trump. Right? I think that there's this inclination where we caricature that segment of the country as being racist, bigoted, hateful, and so on. And I want to couple that analysis with the story that I had really quickly. I'm sorry if I'm saying too much, but a couple of weeks ago I was asked to speak at a church right outside of Nashville that was 95% white. This was Trump country. This was a place where I anticipated it was going to be very hostile to what I came to say. So I had my presentation, my PowerPoint. I was like, let me pitch this PowerPoint. I kind of walked in the room and I fell through and I was like, I'm going to leave this PowerPoint alone. So I gave a talk based on my personal experience, tying in some of the personal narrative of the book. And a third of the room, this is an all-white room, by the way, right? Working class, poor, white church. A third of the room hated what I had to say and wasn't going to be convinced based on how I looked, right? A second third of the room I thought was lukewarm to my message. A final third of the room I think was really moved by my message. And there's a long line of largely middle-aged and elderly white women apologizing, wanting a hug, wanting a signature, and so on, which really spoke to me to say that it's important to step back and understand that oftentimes this demographic that we caricature as being racist and bigoted is being entirely neglected and only consuming negative messaging of Islam through portals like Fox News and through politicians like Trump. And the unfair sort of circumstance I think we have to accept as Muslims is, if it's not us who go into these hostile corridors and these hostile communities and educate them as best we can about what our faith means, about the struggles we're going through, about what the war on terror looks like, nobody's going to speak to them. And the world's an unfair place, and I think that as an educator, perhaps, as a law professor, I sort of assume the responsibility of educating individuals that might be hostile to my message. So the positive message is this, is that I think that there is a segment of the population that we deem or brand to be hostile to us that can be persuaded. It's just going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of elbow grease. It's going to take a lot of going into really hostile and uncomfortable situations and circumstances to change minds.
So I want to pick up on this because this is fascinating to me. So much of your work is fascinating, by the way, but this is fascinating as well. So 1/3 of the room you characterize as being movable, changeable,
Yeah.
perhaps persuaded. And what do you think was key in terms of your presentation? In other words, how do you move that third? What does that look like? Moving that third.
I had like,
So but you're convincing, and I mean, I think, and I'm not oversimplifying here, because you're convincing that third of your humanity.
or just sharing my story, right? So there's one lady, I'm not going to give her name, but she's contemplating converting to Islam based on my speech that day. And that wasn't my objective. I wasn't doing dawah work or, missionary work.
Right.
But she's emailing me all the time, what should I read? What can I look into? Would you recommend speaking to somebody? And I'm not a religious scholar, right? But I think for me, and 3 or 4 of these people told me they'd never met a Muslim. And statistics demonstrate that most Islamophobes have never met a Muslim. So I think just choosing to enter that space and walking in was enough to persuade that third. That segment that was persuadable, that, this is a real dude. You know what I mean? That Muslims aren't these, evil characters that we perpetually watch on places like Fox News. We live in Detroit, obviously, so us Detroiters, we're accustomed to Muslims because we drive into Dearborn, we go into Hamtramck, there's mosques all over the place. But there are specific parts of this country, large parts of this country, where there are no mosques, and where there are few Muslims, and the few Muslims who live in these communities are afraid to conspicuously identify as Muslims because of the fear of backlash. I don't know what it was, but I took off my academic hat, wasn't saying complex words like interest, convergence, and intersectionality, and try to speak to people, in terms that they knew, and I found really had a persuasive effect. So sometimes you got to do that work. It's not comfortable. It's not for everybody. But again, maybe me, because I am an educator, I sort of assume responsibility to do that work.
Interesting, fascinating. I want to, one last question, and then I'll turn it to the audience. And this is actually inspired by one of my students. And I'm trying to articulate this question without getting into the overwrought emotional language. And whenever lawyers say they're not getting ready to do something, that in fact will be the very thing they do. But one of my students was stating that Islamophobia is so powerful that it is interfering with her ability to worship, her ability to pray, her ability to worship in any way that she cares to manifest. And when she said that, it was really crushing. That we're talking about a pain that is that palpable. I think your work does a tremendous job on putting your finger on that pain. But I'm turning to you as what to say to that student, what to say to that person who's experiencing it.
So I think it's important, 2 things, right? So I want to contextualize the first thing I want to say. It's important to have courage, right? It's important to have courage and practice faith and practice Islam the way you want to practice it because it's extended to us by way of the First Amendment, right? So the free exercise clause is part of the First Amendment, and it was made to be the First Amendment for a reason. It was considered a right, a civil liberty that was so central to citizenship. But also to contextualize in history that this isn't the first time that the free exercise rights of Muslims were denied. And in fact, this isn't the first time where the free exercise of religion rights of Muslims has been most vehemently prohibited. Right? I wrote this article called Antebellum Islam in the Harvard Law Journal, which talks about how roughly 30% of enslaved Africans were Muslims. And they continued or attempted to continue to practice Islam when they were bonded to the most inhuman conditions, right? The most challenging, trying, crucible, testing an individual's will was in fact slavery, right? Prohibitions against practicing Islam were mandated by slave code, right? Slave code that was adopted by every state. It was inflicted viciously by slave master and so on. But these enslaved Muslims perpetually continue to practice their faith. They built makeshift masajid, mosques, right? They observed Ramadan. they pray 5 times a day. So if they can endure those more, trying conditions that restricted them from exercising their faith, and even more than restricting exercising their faith, completely obliterating their humanity. That was the construction of blackness, right? That Cheryl Harris talks about whiteness as property. That blackness was made initially framed to be an identity that was synonymous with chattel, with property. So if enslaved Africans or enslaved Muslims can endure those tests, then we can in fact endure the tests that the war on terror poses today.
Fascinating. Okay. So I wanted to leave some time for our audience. I'm sure our audience is riveted and may have questions of their own, and so I just wanted to leave some time for the audience. Does anybody have any questions? And Professor Hammer is kind enough to get the mics moving, so we've got questions all over.
Thank you so much for your insights and thank you for putting this together. Thank you for writing this book. I vibe with it a lot. So I was just wondering, as somebody who's involved into this activism thing and being in the front lines of kind of fighting Islamophobia, I often find it troubling how people would say, like, to white people, we're just as human as you, we're just as American as you, because then that is kind of making whiteness like the epitome of humanity, and whiteness being synonymous with being American. And I find that very troubling. So I was wondering, for me personally, as a black Muslim woman living in America, is it enough for me to just be unapologetically Muslim? Or what else do I have to do in order to attempt to dispel Islamophobia within my own community?
Yeah. No, so I reject these narratives, these ideas that we sort of have to equate or calibrate our humanity in line with whiteness. Because whiteness, in fact, has stood as the benchmark or the synonym for citizenship for a long time. Whether we disagree or agree with that, the law has said that. And the law, in fact, continually says that, even though black and brown people are extended form of citizenship. But we shouldn't buy into the idea that we have to look to essentially equalize ourselves to whites or other classes or other groups that are considered to be, sort of this higher status. So my response to you, and I know you, Khadija, and I think you're doing a fascinating job doing what you're doing as a young activist and as a poet, and as a really trenchant voice for young Muslims in the community, is to be you, right? And not to sort of like calibrate or navigate your identity in line with any benchmark, right? I think that one of the ways in which we break away from white supremacy or sort of punch white supremacy in the face is to say that I'm an individual. Regardless of how you see me based on my Muslim identity, regardless of how you see me for my blackness or my brownness, I should stand alone as an individual that is not tied to these negative tropes or stereotypes that you project onto these racial or religious groups. And that's why I reject these whole narratives coming from oftentimes our people looking to sort of like, uplift exceptional examples of Muslims to sort of justify our humanity. So we saw a lot of that during the travel ban, for instance, right? During the travel ban, we saw these slogans coming from Muslim institutions or pundits saying, Muslims are 10% of doctors are Muslims. Muslims are upwardly mobile economically. Muslims are great patriots. Politicians even capitalized on these exceptional stories of Muslims. We saw Hillary Clinton and the whole, sort of performance of Khizr Khan buying into this exceptional good Muslim performance, which are problematic, right? Because we can't disconnect that from aspirational whiteness, right? That being an exceptional Muslim is almost parallel with this idea that we have to perform white identity or an identity of Muslim identity that is palatable to a majority white audience to be seen as equal or on the margin or fringes of being equal.
This talk was fantastic, as I expected. So my question is, I'm just struggling. So in this project of Islamophobia, I'm struggling with drawing the line between white supremacy. Where does white supremacy end and religious persecution begin? Right? Because there's this way in which we're talking about, Islamophobia as a project of white supremacy. But I want to talk about, Muslims who are blonde hair, blue eyed, they are white, right? And so their experience in this world is as a white person, right? And so for them, perhaps this is not. In many ways, I just need you to help me think. For white Muslims, I want to really think about in what ways it's white supremacy doing the work versus religious persecution, right? Because in some ways, by saying the project of Islamophobia is one where of white supremacy, somehow that reduces the space to talk about the white supremacy again coming from within the community. Or number one, and number two, it just reduces the space to really, a lot of people think when, the general public, when they think about a Muslim, they're not thinking about people from West Africa, from Ghana, right? They don't think about, they think the Middle East, right? And so the ways in which you talk about white supremacy as the kind of overriding project of Islamophobia, we're being erased, African Muslims, right? Because that's not what the world is thinking about. So, for white Muslims, maybe sometimes it's not a project of white supremacy, maybe it's a project of religious persecution. And I say that because when I think about Jewish communities, right, I don't think about that oppression as an oppression of white supremacy. I think about that oppression as an oppression of religious persecution when it exists, right? Although there's a spectrum there as well, right? There's Ethiopian Jews, and but we don't necessarily. And do you think about that as a project of the discrimination that Jews may face as a project of white supremacy? Just help me understand the differences there.
Yeah, I don't know whether to put my academic hat on or my. But these questions are like forcing me to go like back and forth. But let me answer it this way, right? I'm actually writing my next law review article is called Faith in Whiteness, which talks about how religious othering has always been central to the construction and shaping of white identity, right? So whiteness and white supremacy is a fluid, dynamic, ever-changing, enterprising project. And let me start by saying that at one juncture, a whole host of groups that we consider to be now within the confines of whiteness weren't. Jews, for instance. Great book by Karen Brodkin called When Jews Were White Folks. Highly recommend people read that book. A number of studies done on Irish Catholics or Italians as a consequence of their Catholicism being deemed to be non-white, and in some respects being deemed to be black in some parts of this country. So religion has always been central and is still central to how race, and specifically whiteness, is constructed. Now, you know 3 or 4 questions, Professor Edewene, in your statement, but I'm going to try to pluck them out. So the second question is, what do we do with white Muslims? And there's a sizable community of white Muslims not only in this country, but also abroad. If you go to places like Russia, you go to places like former Soviet states, if you go to places, even within the bounds of mainland Europe, there are countries where there are sizable white Muslim populations. Now in this country specifically, because my book is called American Islamophobia, I want to bring it back to the confines of this country, is that there's a specific racialized imagination of who Muslims are, and you're exactly right. It's tied and tethered to the Middle East, the Arab world largely, right? So there's this larger idea, this larger trope, that Islam and Muslim identity is synonymous with Arab or Middle Eastern identity. As a consequence of white Muslims either being born into Islam, in the case of, let's say, a Bosnian Muslim, or let's say a white American who converts into Islam, there's a racial transition that individual makes, especially when that individual chooses to express or perform his or her Muslim identity in conspicuous ways. So for instance, I have a friend of mine in California, a white woman who converted to Islam when I was living in LA. She chose to wear the hijab, right? And she wears traditional Islamic wear. She's a white woman. She traces her ancestry back to, I think, Ireland or England or whatever. But as a consequence of her adopting that identity, her whiteness is either diminished or entirely evaporated. And that's also true for white men who might wear the beard, or might wear a kufi, might wear a thobe, for instance, as a consequence of adopting an outward Muslim identity, broader society doesn't perceive them as white anymore. So there's a racialization transition that happens when individuals embrace whites embrace Muslim identity that is unique to Islam, I think, in some ways.
But that's not true for Jews who perform Jewishness.
Yeah, so exactly. So like, for instance, like conservative Hasidic Jews who wear, the fedora and the beard and so on, they're not making that same racial transition because Judaism is largely racialized as a European or a white religion. Even though, as you state, it's a very ethnically and racially heterogeneous faith tradition. Islam isn't. Islam is very poignantly and acutely racialized as a Arab, Middle Eastern religion, and before then it was framed as an Ottoman religion during the height of the Ottoman Empire here in the United States. And it's disconnected from places like sub-Saharan African countries, you name, even though places like Nigeria, for instance, are 60% Muslim. Even though Ghana, I believe, is roughly 40 to 50% Muslim. Even though Africa, as a continent, is 50% of its entire population is Muslim. There are more African Muslims than there are Arab Muslims, by a clip, I think, of 3 to 1. But because this Orientalist trope tying Muslim identity to Arab identity is so deeply embedded, we ignore and we erase the existence of black Muslims from our imagination. And that's also tied to, beyond just popular ideas and popular stereotypes, it's tied to the law, right? So the legal construction of blackness in this country was framed in irreconcilable terms to the legal construction of Muslim identity. During the naturalization era, Muslim identity was narrowly constructed as a racial identity in the mirror image of Arabs, Middle Easterners, and Turks. And because black Muslims, they don't phenotypically look like Arabs, Muslims, and Turks, we didn't see them as bona fide or legitimate Muslims. And more than that, because blackness was a classification that was made to be synonymous to property, we didn't see blacks as individuals or a class that could legitimately practice any religion. So the legal roots of racial construction and classifications in this country, combined with these prevailing Orientalist tropes, bring about the erasure of seeing black Muslims as legitimate Muslims. There's a lot of things going on, but it's the law and it's the permanence of Orientalist tropes that manufacture the unseeing of black Muslims today.
First, I want to thank you for the talk.
I'm not a doctor, unless you count a Juris Doctor as a doctor.
Close enough. So first, I did want to thank you for the talk. And second of all, so I was born in Egypt, and I spent the first 6 years of my life in Egypt, and then I was raised in an Egyptian subculture for my entire life, even while in America. So just to backtrack on your discussion on feminism, one thing that's always bothered me about my culture is that, you mentioned that, we can separate the idea that Islam denounces or disempowers and disenfranchises women. But what I've seen in my culture, especially in Egypt and in other Arab countries, is this overwhelming sense that women are not equal to men in terms of, at least from what I've seen from my experiences, that, like, for example, in the household, the voice of a man completely trumps the voice of the woman. The man has 90% decision-making power. The woman's role is primarily to cook, clean, take care of the kids. The man makes all the business decisions, pays the bills, works. Some of my more Egyptian family members have even told my cousins, like, oh, don't be a doctor, marry a doctor. So those kinds of things have always bothered me. And I want to ask you, how do we go about differentiating the religion from the culture in this type of thing? And what do we do to, even in like my own culture, for example, what do we do to kind of denounce this narrative and to try to equalize women to men?
Yeah. So I too was born in Egypt. My mom's Egyptian, and I can tell you in my household, women have always called the shots. Yeah. So my mom still, even though I'm like, reading all these articles, reading a book, she still smacks me in front of my friends. You know what I mean? She still has the greatest authority in the household, same as my sister. So my experience has been one where women have been leaders, the most vocal. Maybe that's tied to my circumstance. My parents divorced. My father wasn't around much, so they were forced to kind of occupy that position. But I know a number of Arab and Muslim households where women are the authority, and I'm not going to argue whether that's the exception to the rule or vice versa. But there are a number of anecdotes and stories that display otherwise, right? But I would say that patriarchy is still obviously really rife and pervasive throughout not only Muslim majority countries, but the world at large, right? Patriarchy was once not only controlling culture, but law in this country as well. I think that I contest the idea that Islam in either Arab culture or Muslim culture, if you want to call it that, is especially conducive of patriarchy, sexism, and the relegation of female voices, right? So I disagree with that foundational point, to be frank with you. I think that there are governments, for instance, right, which aren't tied to Islam, or fringe interpretations of Islam, which is the case in Saudi Arabia, which are reflective of the religion in general, and that it's dangerous to sort of conflate, fringe interpretations or dictatorships in the case of Egypt, which is not only non-Islamic, but has criminalized Islam and Muslim identity, in fact, as being the rule of thumb when indicting an entire religion or a culture as being patriarchal. I know that's a complex response, but so growing up as an Arab, the person you admire most beyond your mother growing up is a woman, Kulthum, right? Out of in the room know who Kulthum is, very iconic singer. She's kind of like the Aretha Franklin times 10 of the Arab world. So there's a number of stories, a number of examples, a number of anecdotes that say otherwise. And I know them intimately, and I know them more broadly in Arab and Muslim culture. I just think that they're not told and they're not uplifted as much because, again, they don't mesh with this overarching narrative of these cultures being patriarchal. And if you look today, I mean, when I go and do these talks and stuff, I think Muslim American women are outperforming Muslim men. They're clearly, in academia, for instance, there are giants who are Muslim American women. You look at the head of the Islamic Studies program at Harvard, Intisar Rab, right? You look at Yale, you have scholars like Sabrina Grewal. Stanford Law School, you have people like Shireen Sinar, Sar Aziz at Rutgers. Beyond and within legal academia, there are Muslim women who are not only excelling, but dominating. And I think that, as activists and as Muslim men, maybe it's our issue too, that as Muslim men, we don't do as effective a job to kind of, uplift what our sisters are doing professionally and otherwise. But I'm trying to do that as best I can. My mom hits me if I don't, so.
So I kind of had a question that was similar to the doctor's question. It just seems to me like every time we have a conversation of Islamophobia and white supremacy, I just feel like, I wonder if it would be better to separate those arguments to a certain point. Because I just don't see, like, I see them as two separate issues. And I don't know if the arguments would be better served if we separated them to a certain extent, right? So for instance, like, I'm a Black Muslim, but I don't always feel like I'm experiencing like racism or things like that. I feel like sometimes I'm experiencing religious persecution, And then sometimes I don't feel like I'm experiencing, or like when I didn't learn a job before, sometimes people didn't even know I was Muslim and I experienced something different. The point is that I feel like sometimes when you have the conversations together, it just kind of like muddles the issues and nothing really gets solved. And I also feel like it just kind of does a disservice to both problems because you never really get to the bottom because you're just kind of dancing around it and you're mixing the issues together and they never help get their proper separations that you can like really get to the heart of it. So,
Yeah. So I think there's different roles, or as the young people say, there's different lanes, right? So, you know, my role as a scholar, my role as a public intellectual is to be honest, right? And to analyze what's going on in an honest way. So you can't legitimately discuss Islamophobia without anchoring it and tethering it to white supremacy. So even though it might be more strategic to sever the two when interfacing with an audience in an activist sort of realm or speaking to a specific group, it's, as an intellectual, that's not the correct way to go about it, and that's not the right way to go about it, right? Because what is Islamophobia at its core? And I define Islamophobia in 3 dimensions. And the dimension I want to sort of highlight at this juncture is state-sponsored or structural Islamophobia. Structural Islamophobia is what? State-sponsored Islamophobia is policy, law, and also restructuring of government to fixate and to police Muslim threat. And if we track and if we analyze the history of Islamophobia, both in the modern sense with the War on Terror, and even before the War on Terror, what objective is it looking to carry forward? Right? Whether the Naturalization Act of 1790, to restrict and deny Muslims from becoming citizens, part of that was to safeguard the idea that this is a white country. So how can we talk about Islamophobia in the historic sense without framing it or tying it to white supremacy, when the very objective of Orientalist policy was to maintain the white identity of this country? That's one example. For a modern example today, what is the most vivid structural Islamophobic policy that comes to mind? The Muslim ban, right? The Muslim ban. What is the objective of the Muslim ban? To restrict the entry of brown and black Muslims from coming into this country because we classify them or consider them to be a threat to maintaining the white majoritarian integrity of this country. And guess what? That's not me saying it. President Trump said it by branding the slogan called "Make America Great Again," which is a dog whistle to maintaining the white identity of this country. So if we're highlighting that the most destructive and vivid demonstrations or manifestations of Islamophobia are geared toward protecting the white identity of this country, how can we not talk about white supremacy? How can we sever Islamophobia from white supremacy? It's dishonest, it's short-sighted, and it's myopic if we don't couple the two.
Maybe the problem is that we have that, and we bring in the black life. Like that's always like, we always talk about, we focus very heavily on like the argument of like black Muslims, right? Not that it's not a very real argument, but it's just like, why is it now? This is what everybody stands on. I feel like a lot of African Americans feel like, a lot of African American Muslims feel like their issue will actually be like swept under the rug or hidden because now it's like this bigger issue. And now everybody is just focused on the fact that like there's white supremacy especially.
Can we get you a mic, or can we ask you to stand? And I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I couldn't quite hear.
Yeah, I'm not a real projector. No, I was just saying, like, maybe this is the point where, maybe that's my problem, like, I've thought a lot about this, and it's really hard to articulate, but, like, maybe that's the thing, it's like, you know, I agree with you, like, everything you said, like, how can we not talk about it, but then, you know, it just seems like, now that we want to talk about it, we now want to talk about the black heritage, we want to bring up, like, everything that's going on with black people, but it just feels like, I mean, a lot of African Americans I've talked to or, like, listened to speak, they feel like this whole thing is getting, you know, we're used as an example. It's like, oh, you know, okay, well now we want to care about black issues. And we want to say like, you know, we just kind of want to lump it all together. It's like, we're against Islamophobia and look at how black Muslims live, look what happens to black people. But before, this wasn't an issue. So I guess what I'm saying is that like, sometimes it seems like if you separate them a little bit, they can have their just cause. Like it seems like we're not willing to really have an argument, like a conversation about like what happens to like African American Muslims or African American people in this country without then pulling in all the issues of like Islamophobia and things like that. And then that is where I feel like you can't really settle things because you're now like lumping it all together, trying to kill like 20 birds with one stone type thing, you know? I mean, that's just how I see it.
Yeah.
I can I add to that just a succinct way to ask is maybe, how do we, because you're absolutely right,
Islamophobia and white supremacy are absolutely connected. But how do we, in the same sentence, acknowledge that, but reserve space to talk about white privilege within Islam? That's the challenge, right? How do we acknowledge the connection between Islamophobia and white supremacy, but preserve room to talk about white privilege within Islam? Right? So like that's the challenge.
So can I just take a stab at this? And I believe me, I just want to point out a couple of really good things, and then I'm going to defer to the expert. I think part of the argument is that there was never a point at which Islamophobia wasn't racialized historically in this country. So part of this is the conflation of the two historically, okay? Then, in my mind, white supremacy is so strong with respect to this argument because it gets articulated this way. I've heard a number of times in which people are referred to as black Muslims. And I'm not clear about who is the black Muslim, right? Who exactly is the black Muslim, right? Because when you say the black Muslim, people tend to refer to African Americans as the black Muslim. But that's problematic because if you say African American Muslim, you're talking about an entire continent, right? And there's a problem with sort of the phenotypic description, right? But part of white supremacy is its ability to conflate all of these things and to usurp the business of naming in such a way that self-identity or identification becomes confused, right? So I do see this as very much a racialized space. I do see Professor Beydoun's work as particularly valuable because he has the courage to talk about this as a racialized argument. I think that Professor Beydoun's work also talks about the business of white privilege within Islam, because part of the discussion is also the denigration that occurs with respect to racism, and I'm talking about anti-black animus within Islam. Okay? So those are just my really 3 quick points, but of course I'm going to defer to the expert here.
Yeah, there's a number of questions coming, and I'm trying to like wrap my head as to how to best, answer them. I want to start with this baseline idea: is that since the creation of the American Racial Project, only 2 racial classifications have been existent for the entire duration of the American Racial Project. That's whiteness and that's blackness. And the formation of whiteness was constructed in mirror image of blackness, right? So if blackness meant property, if blackness meant chattel, then whiteness sort of marked citizenship and everything citizenship came with. Everybody else who came to this country who didn't fit neatly within the classifications of blackness or whiteness had to vacillate in between this spectrum. So Arabs, for instance, Latinos, South Asians and so on, who historically didn't have, or for long periods didn't have their own racial designation, didn't know where they fit, right? They had to sort of manipulate or navigate a space within this continuum to sort of identify where they fit within this black and white binary. And again, we talk about that during the naturalization era when immigrants from the Arab world, for instance, they wanted to become white because whiteness came with the greatest prize, which is citizenship. And in order to attain that prize, you had to engage in the project of being anti-black, right? Part of the cornerstones of whiteness is to propagate and participate in the project of anti-black racism. So that's the foundational point that I want to make, that everything, whether we talk about xenophobia, whether we talk about Islamophobia, all these phobias that are tied to racial identity are all tethered to this foundation of white supremacy that is built upon this racial continuum. Now, to the question, and I'm sorry for being super academic, I'm sorry, but it's hard not to talk in those terms. But to Professor Edelweni's question about white privilege within Islam, I really struggle now with a lot of millennials and a lot of young activists have sort of adopted the language of critical race theory, which makes me happy on one end because I'm a critical race theorist, and I think I'm one of the first Muslim critical race theorists to be grappling with this stuff in a serious way. When I went to law school, there weren't many people who looked like me that were interested in this stuff. So people know interest convergence, they know intersectionality, they know what white supremacy means and so on. And you see it happening in real time on social media. You see these terms being, sort of declared and projected at rallies and protests and so on. But one thing that really concerns me is that there's this sort of imposition of a definition of racial identity in terms that clash with the critical race theory tradition. So you'll find young millennials saying things like, Arabs are white, or white passing, and white passing becomes enough to be considered white. That isn't the case. On one hand, what we're doing is we're giving credence to these really problematic designations by the US Census Bureau, that because a group is considered arbitrarily as white, that we should consider them white. And let's think about why Arabs are considered white by law today. And I write about this in an article called Between Muslim and White. There was a case in 1944 called Ex parte Mohriz, which involves a Saudi petitioner who was brown, by the way. We know people from Saudi Arabia and Yemen are dark complexion. And I'll highlight why race and whiteness is so arbitrary in this country. This individual who phenotypically would never be considered white by law as a consequence of him being Saudi in 1944, 10 years after the United States brokered a deal with Saudi Arabia to mine oil and established Aramco, is considered white by law to effectively facilitate American economic and geopolitical interests in the region. That's why Arabs are considered white by law today, based on that ruling. So white passing is not enough to be white in this country. Right? So that conflation of whiteness because somebody phenotypically passes as white is a distortion of the basic CRT tenet that race is a social construction. So white privilege, I would say, is the wrong term to use. I would call it colorism. I would say that lighter complexioned Muslims, I don't benefit from white privilege. And I mean, I get darker in the summer, but I'm not that dark right now. But I'm considered white by law, but I'm weighing on my privilege. I mean, send it to me. I live on Schaefer and Dearborn. I'll give you my address, send it over to me. I don't get that white privilege by any stretch, but I do benefit from colorism. I do benefit from being racially and ethnically ambiguous. I think Arab Muslims from the Levant specifically, who phenotypically have a more fair-skinned identity, benefit from colorism. But they don't benefit from white privilege as a consequence of being Muslim.
And so really quickly to respond.
In a wholesale way, there might be gradients in which they might benefit, but not from the entire enterprise of whiteness.
So just really quickly in response to some of the concerns that you raised, I don't see the acknowledgement of the way in which Islamophobia has been racialized as eviscerating your intersectionality. And what I mean by that is the acknowledgement that this has been racialized does not eviscerate your complexity in terms of your gender, in terms of your race, in terms of your ethnicity, in terms of your religion, and all the ways in which these things become conflated.
Good evening. My name is John Connors III. So I got here a little late, so maybe this was the answer to something I think we're touching on right now. So the question on the base level is, do you ever think people immigrating from Muslim countries or anyone, people of the Islamic faith would be part of acceptable minorities on the whole, in the same way that we saw after Japanese internment, that conflict, that these on books to intern, put them in jail, keep them out, and then we hope. And right now, it's not necessarily the same, but we're seeing conflicts with predominantly Muslim countries. Right, once those things come to an end, do you think that we'll move away, eventually we see obviously, move away from those policies, and then going forward, we will see a larger acceptance of Muslims as an acceptable minority, which will then create, I think, overall division, where it's like blacks are still over here on this side, and again, everyone's over here. Is that kind of...
I get the question. Yeah, it's a good question. I think that, look, I think that there are specific devices that are used and assigned to specific ethnic groups that even though we accept them to be, part of the body politic, and we can look at the Japanese American experience, right? So Japanese Americans were interned in wholesale fashion after Pearl Harbor attacks. I think 120,000 Japanese Americans and Japanese residents were interned after the Pearl Harbor attacks. That's clearly a bleak and dark chapter of American history. But it's not to say that Japanese Americans are no longer stigmatized and that Asian Americans at large are no longer stigmatized. In order to be and now we have devices like the model minority sort of narrative that are assigned to Japanese Americans, Asian Americans at large, South Asian Americans, even Muslims to an extent, to say that you can be part of the body politic, you can be a member of society, but you have to perform this racial and religious identity in a specific way that is palatable and safe to the majority. And we see that already happening with Muslims. Right? Who are the Muslims being celebrated in the mainstream? Let's think about Hollywood, right? So for instance, we have guys like Aziz Ansari or Kamal Numanji. He made that movie The Big Sick. Or people like Hassan Minhaj. Now, I'm not making a normative sort of judgment or assessment dismissing these people. That's not, say it again? Russell, I'm not sure if Russell Peters, I think he's Hindu. Yeah, he's Canadian Hindu. So you have a celebration of specific Muslims, or even let's say in the athletic realm, right? People like Ibtihaj Muhammad, who won a medal in the Olympics, or people like Linda Sarsour, right, who was part of the Women's March, and so on. Muslims who are really championed, or I don't know, like lesser known Muslims like Wajid Ali, who writes for the New York Times. Individuals who have penetrated the American mainstream, but they've done so at a cost. Right? So for Linda Sarsour to be somebody who's taken seriously by the liberal mainstream, she has to set aside a specific dimension of her identity. Don't talk about Palestine. That's too radical, that's too much. For Kamal Numanji, Aziz Ansari, these types, they're largely brown Muslims who are either agnostic or atheist now, are highly critical of Islam, and are largely characters who are performing their male Muslim identity in very emasculated ways, right? And you see, very problematic racial commentaries where these characters are always coveting white women, right? So it's an embrace of either performative whiteness or aspirational whiteness that makes specific Muslims as the kind of Muslims we want to project as the model Muslims or ones that can penetrate the mainstream. Not individuals with critical politics, not individuals who take on positions or expressions of Muslim identity that cannot be assimilated. Right? So there's always going to be this model minority sort of box that ethnic groups or religious groups, as long as they play by those terms, can achieve mainstream resonance. And that's true for Muslims today, and it will continue to be the case tomorrow.
Yeah. So people say, so you're talking about how people view Middle East or North African states as they've been at war constantly for let's say how long. How do you talk to people in a way to explain to them that that's not how it is actually? How do you explain to them that they have been constantly at war, or that or to people that think that America is going to these countries and saving them? Just what's your experience?
So
do people I'm sorry. Do people because I try to explain too. So when you're talking about the white women that were persuaded, that's helpful to me.
Yeah.
But I've also met people that don't has your I've met people that don't change their viewpoints. It's what has it been like in that situation?
Yeah, I've met scores of people that don't change their viewpoints either. And I think that's just part of the reality of doing this work.
Because it's complex,
yeah.
That's historical, there's so many factors that go into that. So is there a way to talk to someone on just in a conversation, I don't know.
I mean, the reality is this, right? Something that I always disagree with vehemently is this idea that American society is ignorant to Muslims. They're not ignorant to Muslims. They've been fed misrepresentations and they've been miseducated about Islam for centuries. So it's more than just ignorance we got to grapple with. We got to undo all this miseducation, right? Which is a really huge chore. So You know, it's a struggle, right? Because I think that you have to engage in a complicated and nuanced conversation to analyze and do away with these stereotypes about why, or these ideas that the Middle East is always at war, perpetual war. Right? I tweeted that the other day, and I'm getting all these troll remarks from people saying, why don't you save your own country? Why don't Muslims take control of their own countries instead of always blaming the West? You know, why don't you guys get rid of your dictators instead of blaming the West and looking at us for safe haven or saving? What people don't know is their own history. They don't understand their colonial history to understand that the boundaries of these countries were not drawn by us, right? The modern contours of Syria's borders, Lebanon's borders, Egypt's borders, Saudi Arabia's borders weren't drawn by you and I. They weren't drawn by Muslims. They've always been drawn by the West. So when we have sectarian strife in a place like Lebanon, when we have sectarian strife in a place like Syria, these groups have been forced to live together and to grapple for power and control of government, not on our terms, but terms that were initially framed by the West, and second, not only framed by the West and drawn by the West, but continually propagated. These are proxy wars, right? That are manufactured and continued by actors like Russia, like the United States. Who's the United States' primary ally in the region beyond Israel? Saudi Arabia, right? Which is vested not only in expanding Wahhabi ideology in the region, which feeds groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, right? But is entirely invested in preempting the self-determination of many of these states because they're looking to maintain their regional hegemony. The United States supports them, right? So we can't talk about these issues without having a real honest conversation. And the reality is this, look, the hardest thing of doing this work, and inshallah in 5 or 10 years I'm going to become a sports agent and do something else. Because I'm getting old, you know what I mean? But the hardest part of this work is making these really complex histories and analysis accessible to people, and especially people who don't want to hear them. And that's why I wrote this book, to be honest with you, because I was so sick of writing law review article after law review article that we know only 5 or 10 people read, and if we're lucky, 4 or 5 people might cite. I wanted to write a book that can, inshallah, trickle down to not only us as Muslims, but to non-Muslims as well, and maybe change the minds of some people. But it's hard work, right? It's frustrating work. And it's harder work because we know that there's infighting within our communities about these issues.
So this will be the last question.
Okay.
First of all, I want to say thank you for this very enriching talk and for this amazing book. I don't really have a question. I just want to tell something to Khadija. So I come from a country where that someone who's not Austrian has never met a Muslim is almost impossible. And so I'm here in the United States since August, teaching German at a college. And the first thing that I said was, yes, the American population is ignorant to Muslims. Because I have 21 students since last semester, and I think no one of them has ever met a Muslim before. So they have really no idea about anything. On April 2nd, I don't know if you guys heard about the Polish Muslim Day.
April 3rd.
April 3rd, sorry. I came to I came into the class, and my students immediately realized that there was something wrong with me. So I gave them the platform. I just told them, guys, if you have any questions about my religion, if you have any stereotypes that you want me to deconstruct, or just ask me. And we spent the entire class just talking about it, and the questions that I got from them were so interesting because they just had no idea about anything. And one of them, 10 days later, she came to my office hour and she told me it's the first time ever she understands that Muslim women are not oppressed. That I basically, just by being me, she changed her entire view of Muslims, and then she told me her anti-family support is strong. And even although I never spoke about my religion in the classroom, she said, I already changed her opinion. So maybe it doesn't really need a lot of work, just be yourself.
I think that was one of the best interviews I've ever heard, so Professor Blanche Cook, really I would imagine, but thank you so much, Professor Cook. And Khaled, thank you so much for your work as a lifetime, for this book, for your gratitude in coming and spending time with us this evening. So I think another big round of applause. What a wonderful audience. I mean, what great questions, what thoughtfulness, and thank you for sharing. I think you can give yourselves a round of applause.
And not to belabor the point, but I really do encourage you to buy this and read it. It is just absolutely phenomenal. I think that we are sitting with a living legend. It's great for me to get in at the ground floor now, because I think that this man will rise to the tune of the Kim Crenshaws, the Cheryl Harrises. His work is definitely on par with their work now. I really do encourage you to read this. So, having said all of that, if you're interested, please stay. We'll allow Professor Beydoun an opportunity to grab some of these so that he can make them available now. And thank you so much again.
Thanks so much.
One more, Dudley.
Thank you.